but just to be respectful of everyone's time that has joined us here today. We are Prevent Child Abuse Georgia. We're housed at Georgia State University in the School of Public Health here. I am Jill Walsh, the program coordinator, and I have been part of the Georgia's Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Plans and all of the implementation planning that's going on throughout the state of Georgia. In a lot of those plannings, we are addressing economic stability and of course, housing. But we have come up against, there's a lot of need for housing information and what's going on, but especially within the child welfare field or professionals who are serving families and children, there might be a little bit of gap in how do we attain housing, stable housing, permanent housing, how do we advocate for better housing situations for our families and children that you guys are working with. So we have with us today, Caroline Durham from the Georgia Appleseed Center, and she is their legal and policy director. And so she has a lot of knowledge on what's going on in the state regards to housing. We know there's current memorandums that are due to be uplifted soon, and there's just a lot going on throughout the state. I also wanted to point out that her group, Georgia Appleseed, along with some others, are hosting additional webinars coming up or town halls. So the first one starting tomorrow. I'm going to put this flyer into the chat box for everyone so that you can check out some of the other events that they have coming up and tune into that as well. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Caroline can start sharing and get underway.
All right. Well, I am really excited to be here. Give me just a second to find. And I love this whole process of having everybody put in the chat exactly where they are, because I see the different organizations you're with. I see that we are representing folks across the state, and really happy to see that and really excited to talk with all of you today. Again, I'm the legal and policy director with Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. We are a law and policy organization, but we have a really specific focus and mission. And the big picture of it is advancing justice for all of Georgia's children. And within that, there are really two buckets that we'll talk about, but we have focus on children experiencing poverty. We're going to touch on that today, children with disabilities, and children who experience the effects of institutional racism. What justice requires is that every child has access to a strong and good education and a healthy home. We're going to focus today on the healthy home piece, but know that there is an intersectionality, there's an interrelationship that we'll talk about. If you are not waking up in a stable, healthy environment every day, you're not having a successful day. Every child wakes up wanting to have a great day. I would submit that every adult does too, and sometimes we forget that. And so where is our foundation and where are we starting? We're going to talk about that a little bit. The policy priorities for Georgia Appleseed this year are keeping kids in class and out of the criminal justice system, dismantling the school to prison pipeline through a variety of programs, and we'll provide some resources about that at the end. And providing effective interventions and supports for children with behavioral challenges. There is a lot of research and a lot of knowledge about, again, the way a child behaves in school may be directly related to the home that they're living in, and whether it's healthy, whether it's a supportive environment. And then there are other pieces that arise that with the right interventions, we can keep our children in school. We can ensure that they graduate and do well. We can make sure teachers are happy, and the community thrives when our children thrive. So those two really fall under the umbrella of dismantling the school to prison pipeline. Ensuring low-income children and their families have access to safe and healthy housing is the other policy priority. And that's really where we're going to spend some time today. I'm going to touch on a little bit about affordable housing, but our real work is around healthy housing. And I do want to take a second to say, if you have questions in the midst of this, there'll be question time at the end, but I've asked Jill to keep an eye on the chat. And so I want this to be interactive. So if you have ideas or questions or concerns or comments, please share. So what is healthy housing and why does it matter? Stable, healthy housing is a foundation to a thriving life. So that's what we're talking about, is not just a house that is doesn't have a leaky roof, that doesn't have sewage running through it, but also is stable. So a lot of times what we see is there are people who are not able to afford their own home, afford their own rent. And so they're couch surfing or they're living in a car. That is not stable housing. And there's a way in which the lack of that foundation impacts and children and their families in a way that limits their successes. What we know about healthy housing is that it is something that can enhance mental health and physical illness. It is something that can cause mental health challenges and or physical challenges. And studies make it very clear that substandard housing impacts physical and mental health. And again, for children, we're going to touch on that often because of the work that you all do. It impacts their success in school and their behavior in class. When they're not doing well in school, when they're not making good grades, when they're not learning, they're not advancing in the way that we want them to, when their behavior is not within the realm of what we would hope for, if it's violating the school code of conduct, particularly for our Black, Brown, LGBTQ, disabled children and impoverished children, we find that there is out of school discipline that takes place. So they're placed out of the schools and they're more likely to end up in the juvenile court system. That's part of the reason that healthy housing is so important. No, it's not letting me pass. Here we go. So, and when we talk about unhealthy housing, how do we know that it really matters for someone? What studies show is that 2 million people a year make visits to the ER for asthma. Oftentimes, the trigger of their asthma attacks that are severe enough to take them to the hospital is a result of mold in the home, again, sewage and other unhealthy conditions. Rodent and bug infestation can create feces in a way that triggers the asthma attack. Lead poisoning, we know, is prevalent in many older homes and hasn't been changed. I'll talk a little bit later about the fact that Georgia's Healthy Housing Coalition helped work on a law this past legislative session that has created a study committee with the House of Representatives in Georgia to look at lead poisoning and its impacts. Mental health and injury can occur. So we had a man who called last year because his daughter had stepped through the floor of their trailer home. And when he reached out to his landlord of 12 years and told him that they needed repairs, the landlord responded with an eviction filing because he didn't want to be bothered with this person who needed repairs on their homes. The mental health component is we are nurtured by our environment. And so it may be that we come into a place and we in fact are strong of mental health. And yet if the environment is negative, there's a way that brings us down. There's a way that people who are living in unhealthy houses and apartments and condos, all of those things, feel shame, feel frustration that can lead to depression and tie into they're not being where they need to be for their mental state. So when we're talking about unhealthy housing, is there a leaky roof? Is there raw sewage? Is there black mold? Are there rodents? Is there noise pollution? And oftentimes it's not lifted up, but two, is there violence in the home or in the neighborhood surrounding the house that makes it not a healthy environment? These are the things that we're talking about in terms of unhealthy housing. One of the reasons that Georgia Appleseed began to work on the healthy housing issues, since children and justice for children is our overarching focus, is we were hearing that there were children who were ending up in the ER due to housing conditions that stressed their health, triggered asthma, triggered medical concerns. And then we were also hearing that there were children who were in the hospital for a variety of reasons that may not have been caused by the health of their home, but they were not able to go back home to heal because of those housing conditions. And so that's one of the motivations for Georgia Appleseed in our work to say, we need to ensure that there's healthy housing across Georgia for all Georgians. I'm going to show you some examples. These are actually in Atlanta, and this is driving around a community that I was doing some work in 2 summers ago. And what we have here is just an example of really an extreme, both in terms of what happens when people are evicted and have nowhere to go. The family that is living on this particular house has created an entire living situation on the front porch of a boarded up home. If you look carefully, you'll see there's a dining area down here at the top of the steps. There's a living room area and there's a sleep area here. This is an extreme, but it is throughout Atlanta, it's throughout Georgia. And part of what I want to lift up in this, I moved to Georgia about 5 years ago. And in my first year and a half, I lived down in South Fulton County. Getting around is being on I-85, I-75, 285, all of the interstates, and not really going through town, as it were. And so there's a way in which those of us who live in the metro area of Atlanta are not exposed to what's going on in our community. And so I lift that up also to say, when we talk about the need for healthy housing, we are meaning housing for people so they're not homeless, housing for individuals so they're not having to live in these sorts of conditions. It's not just in the city, though. It's rural communities as well, that there is a struggle around, is there an availability of healthy housing? One of the things that gets talked about a lot is affordable housing. And so we want to make sure that people are able to pay for, that people are able to find housing that they can afford. And too often what happens, and that's an important concern, and Georgia Appleseed does a lot of collaborative work with Georgia Act, whose focus is affordable housing. The two are in tandem, so that someone might find a house or an apartment that they could afford, only to find that it's not a place that anyone would really want to reside in. Rural communities are struggling with both of these issues as well, the healthy housing issue, as well as affordability. We talk about the impact on impoverished and disabled individuals. HUD has a report that states that less than 4% of residential units nationwide are suitable for people with moderate mobility issues. And only about 1% of all rental units are wheelchair accessible. This particular photograph is one from the newspaper down in Valdosta. This is Sylvester Buck Sharp. And Mr. Sharp lives in Valdosta. He's lived in this home right here for more than 30 years. He had a car accident that resulted in him being in a wheelchair. He used to be a farmer. He used to operate heavy equipment. He's now making $814 a month in Social Security. $814 a month. That's the only income he has. So he's not able to make the repairs on this home that he's been in for 30 years. And the resources simply aren't there. I want to talk a little bit about the poverty issue in Georgia, which I know we're all familiar with, but to have the reality of it sink in part, again, this is not just a rural issue. It's not just a metro issue. It's throughout the state. In Midgeville, Georgia, 46.8% of the residents live below the poverty rate. In Dalton, Georgia, 24% live below the poverty rate. The national average pre-pandemic was that communities were 13% living below the poverty rate. And so this goes to the issue of healthy housing, in part because there's the affordable issue, and are people renting places, and I want to focus on rentals because we're going to touch on evictions. Are people renting places that simply are not healthy because they simply don't have the resources? The other piece is there is a way in which when the economic stress of not making enough, of being house poor, of living on $814 a month and dealing with everything else, makes one feel disempowered, that they don't feel that they can create a change, that they can't engage with their landlord to have repairs done, that they are struggling to get out of the circumstances they're in. All of that ties into as well the issues of mental health, the issues of advocating for yourself in order to get where you want to be. And again, just touching a little bit more on poverty in Georgia. The study by Top Poverty is 2016. We know these numbers are going to be significantly different now that COVID has been around for a year and a half. But in 2016, 12.5 of white residents in Georgia were living in poverty. 24.8 of Black residents were living in poverty, and 27.5. I've left a word out there. I apologize for the Latinx community are living in poverty. So we know those numbers are higher. And I lift that up because it goes to the underlying issue of the type of housing that is available to community members, as well as the impact as we talk in a little bit about evictions specifically and what we see going on with that. So what is poverty? And I wanted just to touch on this. The poverty line, and many of you, because of the work you're doing, may know about this. It's really as defined by the federal poverty guidelines. For a single person, it means making about $12,000 a year. So when we talk about 24% of Black Georgians are living below the poverty line, that means 24% of Black Georgians are making and living on less than $12,000 a year. For a household of two, it's about $16,000. And for a family of four, it means that they're making less than about $24,000 a year. So for those of you who are thinking about what your rent is right now, what your mortgage is right now, what your grocery bill is, how would you in fact pay for those living on these particular financial circumstances? In rural Georgia, and I want to talk a little bit about this as well, because when we talk about resources, what you're going to find is when you're in the metro Atlanta area, there are going to be more resources. There are going to be more nonprofits that are available. There are going to be a way in which sometimes more of the dollars that are coming from the state to the county level and from the federal level to the state and then to the county level seem to be more accessible. 86% of the counties in Georgia have less than 25,000 residents. 86 of those counties. And part of why that's important is we talk about what the resources are, as we talk about finding access to services and information. The more rural the county is, the more rural the resources are, meaning that they simply aren't there in the way that we would find elsewhere. That said, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you unearth where to find those particular resources that you need to address evictions. I did want to touch as well on elderly tenants, elderly residents in Georgia. And again, there is intersectionality here. There are impoverished tenants that are elderly and are Black or brown, LGBTQ. There's not data gathered on disabled tenants or LGBTQ and the impact of evictions and the numbers and the income as we find with these other resources. But I lift up elderly tenants in part because the numbers are so staggering, and in part because the work that we do at Georgia Appleseed really touches on a lot of our young people that we're working with, and their caregivers are grandparents and great-grandparents that are raising them. And so when we think about this and the fact that 10% of renters age 65 or older are behind due to their rent due to the pandemic, and that 800,000 older Americans nationwide are potentially facing eviction because of that. That matters because it impacts our children as well. And we need to be concerned with our elderly tenants as well. Healthy housings and child abuse. Now, I know and saw that many of you are CASA workers, guardian ad litems, working for DFACS. One of the other reasons that Georgia Appleseed got engaged on the issue of healthy housing, in addition to the impact it has on children's behavior and potential discipline in the school to prison pipeline, there's a resource, and I'll find the database and send it to Jill. There's a database that allows you to search by cause, by county of what are the underlying reasons for children going in foster care. In 2018, 24% of the children removed from their homes in Georgia were as a result of unhealthy housing. So let that sink in for just a second. 24% of those children. So if the resources could be provided so the homes were healthy, and imagine what condition those houses and homes must be in to need DFACs to bring their resources in to protect that child, what that means. I would submit also that in terms of child abuse, when adults are not living in healthy homes and their mental health is not strong and or their emotional health is not strong, it leads to other situations that result in harm to children that cause a need to have the resources of DFACs engaged. And so what we're talking about is really challenging and deep and complex, and yet there are ways to address it. One of the things that we saw happen during the pandemic was the eviction crisis has deepened. Jobs were lost because businesses were shut down or closed down. There were limitations in lowering in hours that people had. There were people who needed to stay home to take care of their kids because the kids were not in school. As all of this is happening and beginning to move forward, the state Supreme Court issued a judicial order calling for an emergency closing of courts except for essential critical hearings. So in the work that we do with the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition and with housing advocates across the state, I remember the day when the order came out, and there were emails and calls that we all had that said, certainly that means that evictions won't go forward, right? That it is essential to keep people in their homes, and so having evictions go forward would pause. And what we found in about a 24-hour period was that every judicial district was handling it differently. They were not interpreting the judicial order in the same way that tenant advocates and housing advocates thought that it would. And so there was a need to respond. And we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that each county is responding differently, the fact that there are different resources depending on what county it is and the access that the county governments have to monies. The more rural, the less resources that seem to be coming in. The eviction crisis has deepened. And so part of what Georgia Appleseed has focused on through the Healthy Housing Coalition is dealing with the fact that courts were in crisis. And so we've done studies to identify, and this is one of the studies that through data collection, Georgia State University used the data collected through the Healthy Housing Coalition's Eviction Moratorium Working Group to say, what are the different magistrate courts who handle evictions doing? And so the pandemic had the economic impact we know, which meant that individuals couldn't pay their rent. And then this confusion about what might be happening at the court in Gwinnett versus Troup County versus Clayton County was all over the place. And so that has had a tremendous toll as well. The Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition reached out, and we had about 180 organizations sign on to a letter calling for the governor to, since the courts had not done it, and in fact, it would have to come from the governor, that Georgia issue a statewide moratorium back in the spring of 2020 on evictions, saying that that evictions could not go forward that were connected with the pandemic. And we're going to talk about that delineation. The governor never signed it. The education was there. And ultimately, the Center for Disease Control did, in fact, issue a national moratorium on evictions, which has had an impact as well. I want to pause here for just a second to talk about the CDC moratorium on evictions. It is very narrowly tailored. And what that means is it is a moratorium on evictions that are for individuals who are not paying rent and for individuals whose income is under $99,000 annually. The difference there is evictions can be filed on and have been able to be filed on tenants who violated terms of their lease. So perhaps it turned out that they were smoking in the apartment. Perhaps there was some particular condition that required they do and behave in a certain way that they had not. Those are not protected by the CDC moratorium on evictions. Now, that being said, that's the national umbrella over the state. Again, each county is doing something differently. So there's one theme that I want you to take away in terms of how to find resources, how to find information for what you need to know for yourself, your friends, your community, and those that you're working with. And that is that you've got to go to your county to get the specific information that you need. Clayton County, through the Homeless Intervention Program that Georgia Appleseed has assisted them with over the last 2 years, put together an initiative that the magistrate court adopted, where they actually have a process to connect tenants and landlords to resources through a couple of local nonprofits that have gotten funding, so that when the tenants and the landlords come to court for non-payment, by getting the rent to them, then the dispossessory or eviction action is dismissed. It's a county by county basis in terms of what types of resources like that are there. The important thing too on the CDC moratorium, it is scheduled to end July 31st. So in just a few days. Now, we have been in this circumstance for several months. It was originally going to end in March. Before that, I think it was in December, and the CDC has extended it on several occasions. What I want to lift up here is that while conditions have gotten better in the states in terms of some of the COVID numbers had gone down, we're hearing from the news that the Delta variant is actually going up. When the moratorium was extended this last time, the language that I read in the newspaper coming from President Biden was that would be the last extension. I was telling Jill before we started, I am an eternal optimist. My hope is that there would continue to be some protections, because we need the economy to be such that those who have faced eviction because of job loss and job decrease will actually be protected. We don't know. We'll have to see. As we've gone month to month with the moratorium, it has often been the day before the end of the moratorium that we hear anything at all. And so the different magistrate courts are shoring up to deal with what has been a backlog for many of them around evictions. I will speak some to Clayton County because I've been doing a lot of work through our homeless intervention program there in HIP. As of last fall, they had a backlog of 1,500 eviction filings. There are counties across the state that have between 1,000 and 2,000 backlogged, where landlords have filed for evictions and they've not been able to go forward for the variety of reasons, ranging from the moratorium to the magistrate courts themselves deciding how to handle it separately. So we're going to have to see a little bit about what happens with that. Again, people across Georgia are facing evictions. The judicial district in the county where the tenant lives is what you want to find out about. One of the things that really surprised me when I moved to Atlanta was how many landlords are actually these conglomerate corporations. It doesn't matter where they're housed. It is the judicial district where the tenant lives that matters. And the important piece there is oftentimes, particularly in more rural areas, the magistrate court is going to be the place that will be able to tie you into some of the resources. And we found that in those rural counties below 25,000 residents that I talked about earlier, in those counties, oftentimes the only two resources for housing that were specifically focused on housing was the housing authority and the code enforcement officers. There were not a lot of nonprofits. We're going to talk about how to identify that a little differently. But one starting point for you is the magistrate court. The magistrate court's website often has information that you need on how to deal with evictions, and many of them have the resource links for getting monies that are available for tenants. And I categorize it, money for tenants is actually for landlords too. So we talk about the eviction crisis, and part of the challenge around the eviction crisis is there is a home ownership crisis too. And that is landlords are often in the coalition meetings that I've been going to in the informational sessions because they're trying to figure out how to get their mortgage paid. Time and time again, what we hear from landlords is they've got a good tenant, they want to keep them there, but they've got to pay for their own mortgage. What are they supposed to do? What are the resources that they need as well? Some of these that we're going to talk about also support landlords as well. I want to lift up here, this is a picture of a weekly rental motel that I believe is actually in Savannah. No, I take that back, it's in DeKalb County. And part of what we've seen is the evictions of individuals who are using these motels, weekly rentals. There's an increase in not being able to pay. And there has been the challenge around whether they qualify as tenants under this moratorium. And so what is happening is we're having an increase in the homeless population and all of the concerns and problems that go along with that, even with these circumstances where a landlord who owns a resource such as this is not getting paid. They don't identify someone who is staying in a weekly motel as a tenant, and so the protections are not there. It really is a mess. There are a lot of great organizations that are doing good works around it. The Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition Eviction Moratorium Working Group, that's a subset, has been doing a lot of resource creation and research around what local governments can do to respond to this particular crisis. So what can you do? First and foremost, when we're talking about evictions, is to understand the urgency of an eviction filing. And by that, I mean that when a dispossessory action, that's a term for an eviction filing, when a landlord files a dispossessory action, the tenant has only a few days in which to file an answer. And so if you or someone you know has received an eviction filing, it is critical that they contact the court and have some response to the dispossessory filing. Most county courts, if you go to their websites, most county courts have the forms that are needed to answer. So a dispossessory is filed, and by the landlord, the tenant needs to file a response or an answer. Now, one of the things that we know for impoverished communities and rural communities is access to broadband and access to devices to access the websites can be a challenge. Public libraries and local nonprofits and churches are a good resource to help individuals get access to that. In Clayton County and some of the other counties just outside the metro area, oftentimes there are also computers there. The Atlanta Legal Aid Services, ALAS, in Clayton County and the other counties they serve have navigators who are individuals that can help tenants navigate to identify, are there resources they can tap into? What are their responses and what should their filings be? And so I always encourage people who are facing eviction to get legal advice and support. Georgia Legal Services has statewide offices, whereas the metro area, you would want to tie into Atlanta Legal Aid Services and Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. Each of those three organizations on their web pages also have resources on finding monies to help with back rent, to help with utilities, to help with food, and other needs that individuals may have. So this is a tremendous starting point. And what I want to say too is, so if what I said was, if there's already a dispossessory filed that someone is dealing with, that's one stage. The other component is, if you or someone you know is in a circumstance where there is concern, how will the rent be paid next month or perhaps 3 months from now? Rather than waiting till you're in that place, reach out for the resources. reach out to GLSP, ALAS, and AVLF, and some of the other groups we're going to talk about. Again, with the stages of the eviction, the landlord files a complaint or a dispossessory action. They have to state in the complaint what the reason is for asking for the tenant to be dispossessed of the home that they're in. In the midst of the pandemic, there may be different stages where things have happened. And again, this is where the magistrate court in the jurisdiction in the county where the tenant lives matters, because there are magistrate courts across the state that would not accept complaints, would not accept dispossessory filings at all. There were other counties that accepted the filings and have for a year and a half and have just held them at bay. That's where the backlog comes from, and did not require a tenant to respond to those filings. There are other counties where the court not only received the dispossessory actions, required tenants to respond. If a tenant didn't respond, then the dispossessory order was issued by the court, but was not served on the tenant. The dispossessory order being served on the tenant is when the marshal or sheriff's office shows up and says you have to leave. And so these, I wish it were more clear. I just want to say, I wish it were more clear and easier to say, this is exactly what you need to do. The first and foremost, if you are a tenant and you have received a filing from your landlord saying you must leave, and it's filed with the court, check with your court on what your responsibility is, because if you are required and that court is expecting an answer to the filing and you don't answer, then you lose. If you receive notification from the court that there is a court hearing, and many courts are doing Zoom hearings as opposed to in-person, or allowing the in-person hearings, and you do not appear, you lose. There are very rare opportunities to reopen it. And by lose, it means the court will file an order in favor of the landlord that requires the tenant to leave the home. And so depending on what stage you are at, always, always, always reach out for legal support from one of those agencies that I mentioned before. Time is critical. Communication is important. And again, I want to go back to the acknowledgement and pause for a second in the reality for individuals and families that are living in a place where they are facing eviction. The emotional toll is monumental. For those of you who are working with children in foster care, you see the emotional toll of just that component. It's similar. And so I talk about communication is important and engagement because many times when people feel overwhelmed, they do not and cannot, because they feel like they cannot reach out. And so I want to pause that communication is important, whether it is reaching out and making a phone call to one of the legal services organizations, reaching out to the landlord. I was on a panel yesterday, a call with Susan Reef, who is with one of the housing supervisors for GLSP. And we were taking calls from members of AARP Georgia, actually, a call in. And time and again, people were saying, I've asked for additional monies through the DCA, and I haven't heard anything, or I have asked for an extension here and I haven't heard anything. And Susan repeatedly said, sometimes you just have to call more than once. If you reach out to the legal services agencies, if you're reaching out to the nonprofits that have the resources, if you're reaching out to the court and you don't hear right away, call back, and call back. And that can be even more of a challenge because it adds to the frustration. But the numbers that you've already seen in the early part of this presentation let you know the volume that these agencies are working with. And so continuing to be persistent to get the resources that you need really is critical. So where are some of those resources in addition to legal aid? The Georgia Department of Community Affairs, I mentioned that, DCA, their website, if you go to dca.georgia.gov, they have gotten a significant amount of money that is being utilized to help stave off evictions for tenants. And so when you go to their webpage, you'll see that there's a banner specific to eviction resources. In addition to that, GLSP has a partnership with DCA. So if you're in one of the outlying counties, you can also get the information and access to the resources at DCA through Georgia Legal Services. And so that's an important resource for you. The monies are specific to evictions. There is, whether you are a landlord or a tenant, you can reach out. Many of these programs require that the landlord and the tenant provide information and in order for things to move forward. And so again, the DCA is just a remarkable place to start. I've talked about the magistrate courts in your county because their website and their clerk's offices, because these counties have been working on addressing issues with the eviction moratorium and the eviction filings, they're going to have some of those resources as well. One of the other things that you can do, separate from if you're not in need of immediate financial support to address the rent that's needed, is to think about community engagement. So if this is an issue that is of concern to you, not because you're facing eviction or not because you're a landlord who's dealing with tenants who aren't able to pay, but begin to engage with those around you. Share the information out with friends and family, with community meetings that you can go to. The program in Clayton County came about as a result. The HIP, the Homeless Intervention Program, is a social lab that Georgia Appleseed helped them begin, where we have educators, representatives from the court, tenant advocates, nonprofit organizations, service providers, representatives from the county commission are all engaged and meet. We were doing it quarterly for a while too. Their focus was ending homelessness in Clayton County. And in coming together quarterly, we're creating experiments or initiatives. So experiments or initiatives to say, how can we address this particular concern that we have in our community from all these different intersected places, being champions for our community, knowing that sometimes those initiatives, sometimes those experiments might not work. As a result of the work that has been done, there is a relationship between the magistrate court, the county commissioner, the nonprofits in the community, ALAS, all working together to bring resources so that they have had, in a 6-month period, more than 385 families were kept in their homes as a result of the initiative that was created. The tenants did not end up with a dispossessory or unlawful detainer action on their file, which what we found, we're working with Georgia State University to gather demographic information from those people who are getting the services and asking for the services. More than 80% of the families in that first 6 months were single mother households with children. And many of the children, 60% of that 80%, had children in elementary school. And a significant portion of all of the people asking for services had never before been engaged in an eviction before. And so what we're learning is what the pandemic is doing is having an effect on a broader piece of the community. No piece of the community should be facing eviction. No piece of the community should be without healthy housing. And what we're learning is that when we come together with a common goal, there's a way in which we can build in our communities from the resources that we have in a variety of places like the DCA, like nonprofits, churches. We're finding that fraternity and sorority organizations from the alumni associations are doing great works as well. And those are one of the places, or many of the places, that in rural areas the resources may be found. I want to talk too about engaging with your local legislators. Oftentimes we don't think about the state legislature, except when the legislature is in session and the AJC is telling us what's going on. I had a really interesting experience in the last year, being actually down at the Capitol on a couple of bills that we were concerned with at Georgia Appleseed. And time again, what we heard was the legislators want to hear from you. They know that the advocacy and policy organizations are going to be there lifting up the call to action that we are hearing from those that we are engaged with. The legislators want to hear from those who are right there in their backyard. When they're not in session, most of the legislators have regular 9-to-5 jobs, and they are available and accessible. And so I encourage you to reach out to your state representative, to your state senators. And frankly, right now, the U.S. Congressional representatives in Georgia are incredibly active in what's going on federally. And a lot of the resources that we are getting statewide are coming from the federal government. They're very engaged, and much of the nation is looking to Georgia. We've been in the news for a variety of reasons during the pandemic that it has folks looking, in part because we are a model in many ways, and the model often is the solution piece. And so I encourage you to reach out and lift up these issues with your legislators. I put on here county commissions as well, because part of what is happening is the resources are staying within the government realm and they're coming to the county commission. And so if you have concerns or ideas about how to get resources distributed in an equitable fashion in your community, your county commissioners want to hear from you as well. Ideas that are unspoken are ideas that don't come to light and don't come to fruition. And so we encourage you to engage there as well. I've mentioned again, churches, civic engagement organizations, schools. What we're finding in the rural areas is the school superintendents are very engaged and care about these issues on housing, because lack of stability in housing means school mobility. And school mobility is, and many of you may know this, how often does a child change schools during a school year? One of the primary causes for school mobility in a school district is the child having to move because of evictions or because of other needs that have to do with a lack of stable housing. So your school districts can be a really good resource as well, particularly in rural areas. If any of you are from Early County, the school superintendent there, whose name escapes me, I'm not thinking of her right now, we had meetings with her and her team just a few months ago. They are aware of the needs and they are doing what they can to keep their children, those children's families in homes that are healthy. The Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition. Georgia Appleseed is the backbone organization for the Healthy Housing Coalition. It is made up of statewide nonprofits, local and community engaged organizations across the state. Our focus, again, is ensuring that healthy housing is accessible, healthy housing is vibrant. We have many legislative initiatives that we work on, and we work to share out information to communities because, again, information is knowledge and power. There is an equity working group that's part of the Healthy Housing Coalition. We are working with Georgia ACT to amplify the engagement of rural communities around these issues, the engagement of Black and Brown communities, impoverished communities, people with disabilities, LGBTQ communities, because the impact is even greater, as I talked about earlier, for those particular communities. So I encourage you, if it's of interest to you or an organization you're working with, become a part of the Healthy Housing Coalition. Reach out to get the information, or there are initiatives that you are engaged in that perhaps we don't know about that we need to share out as a model, as an answer, as a solution. I ask and encourage you to engage with us. I did want to lift up too, and in the legislative work that we do, I mentioned earlier that there was a bill that we supported this past legislative session, sponsored by Representative Sharon Cooper, who does just remarkable work on housing issues, on health issues. She's a nurse who is also in the legislature. In 2019, Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition worked to get House Bill 346 passed. And what that does is it says that a landlord cannot evict a tenant for requesting repairs. What we were finding was tenants were afraid to ask for repairs to be made, and really egregious situations where they lived in a multi-unit building and the person upstairs would flush the toilet and that would rush down into their living room. Lack of electricity in a unit, so that they were running electrical cords out into the hallway to be able to have fans operating in their homes. And so what this law does is it makes it illegal for a landlord to evict a tenant when the real purpose is to avoid having to make repairs. The other important piece that is within that is there are punitive damages and attorney's fees that will be awarded. And I lift this up in part because it sends a bigger message to those landlords who are not engaging in a way that, in a responsible way that they as landlords have. But it's a way to empower tenants to be able to access attorneys. There are a group of attorneys in the Atlanta area that I know of. They call themselves community lawyers. So while they're private lawyers working outside of legal services, they're not part of that. They want to provide services to individuals who typically would not have access. By having attorney's fees as one of the consequences for a landlord doing an illegal eviction action in retaliation for requests for repairs, the attorneys get paid after the fact, so the tenant has access to much needed legal services. So I want to lift that up in part so you know about it, share about it. We've got information about it on our webpage, as we do with regard to the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition. And also just so that you can be aware, because it's an important resource that's out there. Before I go into research, I'm going to take a peek in the chat room. And I see that folks are continuing.
So we have a couple in there. I'm going to start with Paula's, and she wanted to ask, are there any protections in place for those residing in assisted living?
You know, that's a great question. And I would say that I would check with, I don't know specifically. I would imagine the question is if they are in fact tenants. I would anticipate that they are. Paula, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And this is for anybody. There are a couple of organizations I'm going to send your way. And I know that, Joe, you put it in the other materials as well. Send me an email and I will make sure that I get that out to you. There's an organization and Mariel Shively is the executive director, and they are focused on some of the issues that you're talking about, as well as GLSP being able to be a resource for you. And I see that Jenny Wood has asked about the link about the county to county details. I will make sure I get that out to Jill and she can get that out to you.
I was looking for a couple of the databases I know, and I'll put those in the chat box as well. I don't know if they have that specific information, but they have a lot more data dashboards on DFACS than is linked to their website that I'll put in the chat box in just a minute. That might be helpful as well.
And there are a variety of resources we have. Georgia Appleseed. Oh, I hate when I see a typo in my presentation. Okay, I threw in the school reopening town hall series right at the end. Jill has shared that in the link. It's a 3-part series. The focus tomorrow, we're going to have some youth that are talking. We're going to have some parent representatives, as well as some other experts in child law to talk about what's going on and what we need to be concerned about as school reopens. These next 4 are guides that you can access through our webpage. We're really excited about this manual, Medicaid Appeals Manual. Now it says it's a Getting Kids the Care They Need, Peach Care and Medicaid Appeals Manual for attorneys. It says for attorneys, we have written it in a way that it's not just for attorneys, but what we know is so many of the services that our children need would be covered by Peach Care and Medicaid. And when an appeal happens, it can be frustrating and scary. This will walk you through how to do an appeal. It's a lovely, you can get a hard copy too if you ask for it on the webpage, that will walk you through step by step. The help guides for children with behavior and learning challenges, that's really designed for caregivers. And it talks about all sorts of resources ranging from special education concerns, discipline concerns. It talks some about what the tribunal process is. A tribunal is where a child is behaved in a way that the school wants to expel or suspend them for 10 days or more. And so the help guides are really a collection of one-pagers that provide really straightforward guidance and additional resources for you to tap into around that. And then When My Child is Disciplined at School is a guide for families to understand how to deal with school discipline. In August, we're anticipating that our Healthy Housing Toolkit, which will be a guide for those of you who are familiar with our help guides for children with behaviors. This is a guide much in that same format, a lot of white space, written not like lawyers. That's something that I try to get folks to do all the time, is to not write lawyers. But it will talk about how to advocate around housing issues. It will talk about where some more resources are. And again, we have an August release date. Check our webpage in late August, and that should be there. I also want to mention, because of those of you who are in the room, the Tribunal Representation for Children in Care is a project that Georgia Appleseed does. Children in care who are facing a tribunal, we look to match them up with volunteer lawyers. And we also have a more formal relationship with GLSP going forward as a result of a wonderful 2-year grant that we've gotten. And so on our webpage, if you do Tribunal Representation or Tribunal Volunteer Lawyers Network, there's a referral form. Anyone connected with a child can reach out and ask for representation for that child in care facing long-term suspension or expulsion. Much like evictions, time is of the essence, because oftentimes the tribunal is going to be within 10 days. And so we need a quick turnaround. We always ask you to ask for continuance, but if that's an issue, reach out to us. We've got the resources. We're here, and we're excited to support the work that you're doing, so that the children you're working with can thrive, and so that the families you're dealing with can have good homes.
We have another question from Liliana. Is there any kind of protection for victims of domestic violence in order to avoid eviction?
There is, and again, the legal services organizations can provide that. There's also the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Again, Jill, I'll get the link for that. I was just sharing that out yesterday, which has resources not just from a state about providing advice around those sorts of concerns, but they also have chapters in different counties. So if you have a domestic violence issue, they're going to be able to give you resources as well in that county. So Jill, I'll get that out to you later today as well. And thanks for putting the dashboard up.
And I have their general link in there. So gcadb.org.
I'll see it. We've got the dial-in on it. I'll get the
Awesome.
the one that particular statistic came from, and share it out with you.
Awesome. And all the additional ones that Caroline is talking about right now, I'm going to be posting on our website under the webinars. I've already put the slides there. I'll put the recording there, and a couple other resources that she's mentioning now to make sure you guys have links to those. So our website, here is our webinar one. I'm now going to share the final